In the 1990s, Russia was rife with crime. It seemed that every city and even every neighborhood had its own gangs. Some engaged in racketeering, others controlled entire markets, and still others terrorized entrepreneurs and kept ordinary residents in fear. But even against this backdrop of criminal lawlessness, one particular group stood out, whose name became synonymous with crime. It was a gang of werewolves in uniform led by Vitaly Kuznetsov, later nicknamed the Fur Coats by the people. They wreaked havoc in Samara and the Samara region for a relatively short time, from June 1995 to December 1996. However, during this short period, they managed to leave such a bloody trail that they are still remembered today. They were distinguished by their cruelty, audacity, and arrogance, bordering on madness. The Shubniki's actions made the hair of local residents, who were accustomed to street crime, stand on end. The gang story began in the first half of the 1990s, when a young, seemingly promising police officer named Vitaly Kuznetsov, born in 1972, served in the Transport Theft Prevention Department of the Samara Regional Main Directorate of Internal Affairs. Behind his exemplary appearance lay cold calculation. In 1995, he offered his acquaintances an easy way to make a lot of money. In reality, it was a path to bloodshed and crime. It was Kuznetsov who was later recognized as the organizer and ideological inspirer of the organized criminal group. He devised robbery schemes, developed plans, and provided the Shubniki with weapons, transportation, and disguises. His police badge gave him a unique advantage. It allowed him to easily avoid suspicion and create the illusion of legality for his actions. Kuznetsov made Andrei Netasov, a former OMON fighter who had been expelled from the police force for numerous offenses, his right-hand man. This man had military training and considerable experience in combat operations, which made him indispensable in the gang's combat episodes. In addition to the leader and his deputy, the organized crime group included 6 notorious thugs: Ruslan Babiyev, Yuri Ifendiv, Sergei Kolyev, Vladimir Ishchenko, Roman Davikin, and Valery Litvinov. Each of them was distinguished by particular cruelty and a willingness to cross any line for money. In 1996, another person joined the gang, Yuri Agripov, a security inspector at one of the pawn shops. His connections in the shadow financial sector only expanded the capabilities of the fur coat thieves. According to the most conservative estimates, in just a year and a half, this gang managed to carry out a series of daring raids, robberies, and cold-blooded murders. The gang is responsible for at least 10 human lives. The first documented victim of the Shubniki was Leonid Privalov, a resident of the city of Kinel. This man was a well-known and respected figure in certain circles. By profession and vocation, he was involved in antiques, and his main passion was numismatics. Over the years, he had amassed the largest collection of rare coins in Russia, which experts estimated to be worth at least 400 million non-denominated rubles. He was considered one of the richest collectors in the country. Such fame and wealth made him an ideal target for Kuznetsov's gang. In the summer of 1995, on one of the warm June evenings, Privalov was returning home in his Volga car. When he pulled up to the gate and got out of the car to open it, Vitaly Kuznetsov and his right-hand man, Andrei Netyasov, were already waiting for him. The attack was swift. The collector was struck on the head with the butt of a pistol, after which he was dragged into the bathhouse located on the property. There, a brutal beating began. The bandits beat and tortured the man, demanding that he reveal the hiding place of his collection. But Privalov, despite the unbearable pain, did not say a word. He kept the secret to the end, perhaps hoping that his silence would save his loved ones and his business. He paid for this with his life. Kuznetsov personally strangled him with a belt. As a result, the gangsters only managed to steal the gold jewelry they took directly from the body of the murdered man and several gold dental crowns, which they barbarically pulled out. The value of these items was estimated at approximately 9 million rubles. In addition, they took about 5 million rubles in cash and $400 from the house, a paltry sum compared to the legendary coin collection that Privalov never gave up. But that didn't stop the killers. The successful operation only emboldened them. The fur thieves carried out their next raid a couple of months later, in August 1995. Their target was Svetlana Golikova, the wife of Sergei Golikov, a well-known Samara businessman. Sergei was the owner of Bonus, a wholesale alcohol trading company, and was considered a very wealthy man at the time. An informant who knew the Golikov family well and had access to information told Kuznetsov that large sums of cash were periodically stored in the businessman's apartment. On certain days, there could be up to 500 million rubles there. It so happened that Golikov was going on a business trip in August, and a large sum of money was expected to be left in the apartment during his absence. The accomplice for the next crime was an acquaintance of the Golikov family who knew their daily routine well and, most importantly, had the trust of the couple. It was he who called the entrepreneur's apartment to prepare the ground for the raid. The call was answered by the businessman's wife, Svetlana Golikova. The informant introduced himself and said that he was going to visit her husband's home to collect a debt for a batch of alcohol. This seemed quite natural, since Sergei Golikov was in the alcohol business and such visits were commonplace. The woman did not suspect anything and opened the door. At that moment, Kuznetsov and Netyasov, armed, entered the apartment with the debtor. Everything happened quickly. They immediately took control of the situation. First, the bandits secured themselves from possible witnesses and the threat of publicity. They dragged Svetlana's young daughter and her elderly mother into the bathroom, locked the door tightly, and threatened to kill them if they made the slightest noise. The robbers threw Svetlana Golikova to the floor and began beating her, demanding a large sum of money. Overcome by fear and pain, the woman was forced to hand over a briefcase containing 70 million rubles in cash, as well as a bag with foreign currency worth another 15 million rubles. But even this substantial sum for those times was much less than the expected 500 million rubles reported by the informant. The enraged bandits continued to beat her. Svetlana cried, begged them not to touch her child and mother, and swore that there was no more money in the house. But that did not save her. Kuznetsov and Netyasov, dissatisfied with their loot, strangled the woman with a dog leash right in front of her relatives, who were locked in the bathroom. After the murder, the robbers calmly gathered their valuables and left the apartment, leaving the girl and the old woman alive, probably only because they decided not to waste time on new victims. Shortly after this crime, Kuznetsov's gang committed another brutal murder. In December 1995, the leader of the group himself showed how dangerous and unpredictable he had become. His next victim was his neighbor, Tatyana Dus. The woman often reprimanded the young policeman for noise, disorder, or behavior, and quarrels regularly broke out between them. In one such conflict, Kuznetsov could not contain his rage. He literally beat her to death with his hands and feet right in her apartment. To hide the traces of the crime, the policeman wrapped his neighbor's body in a bag, loaded it into his car, drove it to the South Bridge area, and threw it into the water. For a long time, there was no news of the missing woman, and it was only in the spring of 1996 that her body floated to the surface and was discovered. By this time, the gang was acting more and more brazenly. In August 1996, Alexei Anganzarov was killed by the Shubniki. Kuznetsov came to his home in Tolyatti and, taking advantage of his status as a police officer, put the man in his car, ostensibly for questioning about a car theft case. Together with Netyasov, they drove Anganzarov to Samara, a distance of about 100 kilometers. But on the way, Kuznetsov ordered them to turn into a forest. There, they forced the captive to record a message to his wife demanding a ransom. The gangsters gave Alexei Anganzarov one chance to stay alive. He had to give his wife a note and an audio message asking her to collect $50,000 in exchange for his freedom. His voice trembled, his words betrayed his fear, but there was still a glimmer of hope. Perhaps he believed they would let him go. However, it was all just a cynical game. After dictating the message, the robbers attacked the man, beating him with particular cruelty. According to the participants' recollections, the blows were not only delivered with their hands and feet, the bandits jumped on him as if trying to break every bone in his body. At one point, Kuznetsov decided that the victim was already dead. To cover their tracks, he and Netyasov went to the nearest gas station for cans of gasoline. Returning to the forest, they unexpectedly discovered that Anganzarov was still alive. Wounded and bloodied, he was trying to crawl away, clinging to the ground with his hands. This episode became a true illustration of Kuznetsov's sadism. According to Netyasov, his leader did not hesitate to pour gasoline directly onto the victim's body, even pouring fuel into his mouth. After that, he set the unfortunate man on fire. Anganzarov died in terrible agony, and the bandits calmly drove away without the slightest twinge of conscience. But the criminal activity of the fur coat thieves did not end there. In October 1996, they carried out 2 more daring raids. Unlike the previous incidents, these attacks did not result in any deaths, although the victims went through a real nightmare. In mid-October, an Indian citizen named Singri arrived in Samara. He came from Moscow with the aim of expanding his business and started trading in leather jackets and raincoats. The foreign guest rented an apartment where his friends, partners, and girlfriends often gathered. One such evening took place in the usual atmosphere of the 90s, with music, conversation, and alcohol. Everything seemed peaceful and carefree until the doorbell rang. People in uniform appeared at the door and presented their police badges. It seemed like another routine document check, but as soon as the law enforcement officers entered, everything changed. Yuri Agripov, a member of the gang, acted quickly, grabbed Singria, and struck him several times in the face and head with his knee. The man lost his balance, and at that moment, a gun was pointed at him, demanding money. Singri, realizing that resistance was futile, handed over the briefcase, which contained both dollars and rubles, a total of about 4.5 million rubles. But the bandits decided not to stop there. They laid all the guests on the floor and tied them up with duct tape so that no one could raise the alarm. The atmosphere in the apartment instantly changed from a friendly party to a hostage drama. The robbers took not only money, but also goods, 3 expensive leather coats and 6 jackets, which had a market value of about 10 million rubles. The next victim of the fur thieves was businessman Oleg Lesov, a man who traded in fur products at the Kirovsky market. His business was quite profitable, as in the mid-1990s, fur coats remained a symbol of wealth and were in high demand. Lesov kept his goods in his garage, which, as it later turned out, was a fatal mistake. Kuznetsov's gang decided to prepare thoroughly for the raid. In mid-October 1996, they went to the market, where they spent the whole day secretly observing the entrepreneur. By evening, it became clear. Lesov was taking his goods home in his own Niva to his dacha, where he hid the fur products in his garage. Watching him, the gangsters developed a plan. The next day, October 20th, Kuznetsov and his accomplices set up an ambush right at the entrance to the house where the merchant lived. When Lesov returned in the evening and got out of the elevator, several men suddenly pounced on him. They acted quickly. They knocked him to the floor, tied him up, and began to beat him. At that moment, Yuri Agripov snatched the merchant's garage keys and car documents, after which he and an accomplice drove the Niva from the Dacha Street to Chernorekinskaya Street. There, in the darkness, the criminals slowly transferred the goods, 18 expensive mink and raccoon coats, to another car. While part of the gang was busy with the furs, the rest held Lesov himself. They pushed him back into the elevator and sent him to the top floor, where they stabbed him several times with a knife, trying to intimidate him and render him helpless. Despite serious injuries and blood loss, the entrepreneur miraculously survived, although he was on the verge of death. According to the investigation's recollections, in addition to Agripov, Vitaly Kuznetsov and Ruslan Babiyev participated in this attack. Almost all of the stolen fur coats were quickly sold through black channels. Only 2 items were kept by the gangsters themselves. Kuznetsov and Netasov took 1 coat each and, without hesitation, gave them to their wives as gifts. However, the expensive fur coats stolen from Lesov played a cruel joke on the gangsters. The businessman, well aware that theft was common in his line of business, had come up with a way to protect himself in advance. He made a special mark on the lining of each item, a neat letter L, the first letter of his surname. This later played an important role in the investigation, as these marks immediately indicated the source of the fur products and made it possible to trace the chain of distribution. Meanwhile, Vitaly Kuznetsov himself continued to behave in an increasingly bold and unpredictable manner. In November 1996, he learned that someone had stolen an old bicycle from his parents in the village of Tamilova. It seemed like a trifle, but the hot-tempered and vengeful werewolf in uniform took it as a personal insult. Suspicion almost immediately fell on his family's neighbor, the unemployed and previously convicted Yamanov. Kuznetsov summoned the man for a talk, threatened him, demanded a confession, but the man insisted on his innocence, repeating that he had nothing to do with the theft and that the policeman was mistaken. However, Kuznetsov was not accustomed to leaving things unresolved. Fearing that Yamanov might report him to his superiors in response to the threats or, worse, take revenge on his family and set fire to his parent house, Vitaly decided to eliminate the potential enemy. He took the man to the nearest forest, forced him to lie face down on the ground, and cold-bloodedly shot him in the back of the head. For Kuznetsov, this was no longer a robbery for profit, but a demonstration of absolute power and impunity. He killed out of personal revenge, leaving no witnesses. With each new crime, the fur coat thieves became increasingly cruel and cynical. In December 1996, they carried out several raids at once, one of which was an attack on 3 businessmen, the Kutashevs and their colleague Olga Braznikova. All 3 were involved in the fur trade and regularly flew to Turkey for shipments of goods. On December 11th, they were on their way to Kurumik Airport, from where they were to fly out for another purchase. However, they never made it to the plane. Kuznetsov and Netisov had been watching this family for a long time. Back in October, they had discussed the possibility of an attack, knowing that the Kutashevs usually carried large sums of cash with them to purchase goods. The best way to intercept the businessmen was considered to be to capture them directly on the highway under the guise of traffic police officers. Kuznetsov had a uniform, and his baton and ID card added the necessary credibility. And so, on the evening of December 11th, fate brought the victims and their executioners together. As Kuznetsov and Netisov were driving along the highway, they noticed a familiar 99th, the Kutashevs VAZ 21099. Without hesitation, they turned around, caught up with the car, overtook it, and stopped it, raising their batons as if it were a standard check. In a confident tone, they demanded that the car accompany them to clarify the circumstances of the stolen truck bed. At the fork in the road towards the village of Alexievka, the 3 unfortunate businessmen were taken into a remote forest. There, the bandits acted according to their usual plan. They forced their victims to lie face down, pressed their hands to the ground, leaving them no chance of escape. The cold-blooded leader of the gang, Vitaly Kuznetsov, took it upon himself to do the dirty work and shot his captives one by one in the back of the head. Everything happened quickly, as if according to a pre-planned scenario. After the massacre, the fur coat thieves thoroughly searched the bodies of the dead, taking $18,000 with them. Kuznetsov himself, as his accomplice Andrei Netisov later revealed, showed not only cruelty but also perverted baseness. He even searched the intimate parts of the murdered women, hoping to find hidden money. This monstrous episode clearly showed how degraded the gang leader had become, for whom murder had become a common way of solving problems. It is unknown how many more lives the werewolves in uniform could have taken if they had gone unpunished. Their brazen attacks and utter contempt for human life stumped even experienced operatives. Fortunately, the events of early 1997 put an end to their bloody reign. But before they were stopped, the gang managed to commit one more crime. In early January 1997, the Pavlov family was returning from the Kirovsky market. Their car was loaded with a large batch of fur products, fur coats that they planned to sell. On one of the roads in the Kuybishevsky district, their car was stopped by 2 men in police uniforms, Ruslan Babiev and Yuri Ifendiv. Dressed as law enforcement officers, they acted confidently and arrogantly, demanding documents for verification, and thereby instilling a false sense of security in their victims. In reality, it was a premeditated trap. Later, the court would establish that it was Ifendiv who shot the Pavlovs. However, the scenario for the robbery was developed by Kuznetsov and Netisov. For them, it was just another in a series of bloody raids, another opportunity to profit at someone else's expense. The Pavlovs were among the last victims of a gang whose thirst for profit knew no bounds. February 1997 was a turning point. Law enforcement agencies finally managed to track down the fur coat thieves. Criminal investigators carefully gathered information, checked contacts, and analyzed all the coincidences. Gradually, the picture began to come together. Crimes committed with terrifying regularity led to the same group. A series of arrests began. One by one, the gang members were detained, depriving them of their usual support and confidence in their impunity. During the investigation, most of the detainees remained stubbornly silent, hoping that there would be insufficient evidence. None of them cooperated with the authorities, except for Andrei Netyasov. He decided to break the code of silence and gave detailed testimony, exposing each of his accomplices and revealing many details of the crimes. His testimony became key to the case, allowing investigators to finally connect all the episodes of the Kuznetsov gang's bloody history. The investigation dragged on for months. A huge amount of material was collected, dozens of volumes. It was only at the end of 1998 that the defendants were given the opportunity to familiarize themselves with the case. The first court hearings began, which were supposed to put an end to this grim story. But suddenly, an event occurred that jeopardized the entire process. One of the voluminous volumes of the criminal case mysteriously disappeared from Detention Center Number 1. The morning of that day began as usual. Documents related to the fur coat thieves case were delivered to the detention center, voluminous materials collected by the investigation over many months. But in the evening, when the folders were returned to the prosecutor's office, the inspectors were shocked. Instead of pages with interrogations, material evidence, and expert opinions, there were ordinary newspapers, neatly stacked inside. This egregious case was evidence not only of negligence, but also of someone deliberately trying to ruin the case. The consequences were immediate. After the documents disappeared, 3 suspects had to be released from pre-trial detention at once: Roman Davidkin, Sergei Kolyev, and Vladimir Ishchenko. This was a serious blow to the investigation. Upon his release, Ishchenko did not even consider returning home. He immediately went into hiding, effectively challenging the entire system. The search for him dragged on for almost 3 years, and it was only in January 2000 that the fugitive was apprehended and returned to custody, just in time for the start of the main court hearings. Unfortunately, the story of the lost volume was not the only one. By the summer of 1999, 2 more gang members, Valery Litvinov and Andrei Netyasov, were also on the run. The trial was effectively stalled at that point. The materials were returned for further investigation again and again. It was necessary to restore the lost documents and collect additional evidence. But every time it seemed that the process was finally moving forward, new strange things happened. Once, another volume of the case disappeared, as if the system itself was resisting bringing the crimes of the fur coat thieves to a logical conclusion. Despite all the difficulties, the investigation still managed to bring the case to court. Key documents were restored, witnesses were re-interviewed, and in the end, the materials reached the courtroom in more or less complete form. The sentences were harsh, but not as cruel as the relatives of the victims might have expected. The gang's organizer, former police officer Vitaly Kuznetsov, was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison. His accomplices, depending on their degree of involvement in the crimes and proven guilt, received sentences ranging from 7 to 16 years. Andrei Netyasov, who cooperated with the investigation and testified against other members of the organized crime group, was the only one who was acquitted of murder charges, leaving only charges related to the raids. But surprising episodes continued to occur. For example, Yuri Agripov, another active member of the group, remained the only shubnik who could not be detained for a long time. He was sought for years, a federal search was launched, and information was passed on through Interpol channels. It was only in September 2006 that it became clear that Agripov had been in prison all this time, but for a different case. He was unexpectedly found in Samara Penal Colony No. 5, where he had been serving a sentence for robbery for several years. When the coincidence was revealed, another 11 years were added to his existing sentence for participating in Kuznetsov's gang and all confirmed crimes. However, this was not the end of the story of the fur coat thieves. In the fall of 2006, Ruslan Babiyev was released from prison on parole. Upon his release, he immediately went to his longtime mistress, Evgenia Golubieva. By that time, the woman had already suffered a heavy loss. Her husband, Samara businessman Gennady Golyabev, had died unexpectedly and mysteriously just a few months before Babiyev's release. After Gennady Golyabev's death, his widow Evgenia found herself in a favorable position. She inherited not only a solid business, but also a spacious apartment in Samara, as well as an expensive Lexus car, a symbol of wealth and status. It would seem that fate had smiled on the woman, but her decision to trust a former criminal cost her her life. In February 2007, Evgenia issued a general power of attorney to her lover Ruslan Babiyev, effectively giving him control over all her affairs. By this time, Babiyev himself was assuring those around him that he was going to start a new life, allegedly saving money to buy a country house and live in a new way. But instead, he carried out a monstrous plan. On February 18, 2007, the man took Evgenia to a forest belt near Samara. There, he cold-bloodedly strangled her with a rope, getting rid of the woman who trusted him completely. To cover his tracks, he tried to stage her life after death. He sent himself text messages from Golyabiva's phone, pretending that she was still alive and going about her daily business. But the illusion proved fragile. 3 days later, Babiyev went further. He took Evgenia's 16-year-old daughter to the forest near Sizran. The girl met the same fate as her mother. Babiyev strangled her with a rope, then hastily covered the body with snow and branches, hoping that the spring thaw would destroy the evidence. But the bloody series did not end there. In early March, the criminal brutally murdered Evgenia's sister, Olga Kuznetsova. The woman was lured into a garage on Alma-Ata Street, where Babiyev cold-bloodedly stabbed her to death. The apotheosis of this horrific series of murders came on March 4, 2007. Ruslan Babiyev went to the home of Evgenia Golyabiva's parents and shot them both with a hunting rifle. Thus, in just a few weeks, he destroyed an entire family: the mother, daughter, sister, and parents of his lover. Even for the criminal world of Samara in the 1990s and early 2000s, this series of crimes seemed extremely savage, and many local residents nicknamed Babiyev the Chikatilo of Samara. The investigation left Babiyev with no chance of escaping justice. His attempts to create an alibi using fake messages from Evgenia's phone seemed ridiculous and did not convince the investigators. He was soon arrested, and the court sentenced him to life imprisonment, putting an end to his bloody story. Meanwhile, the fate of another key member of the gang, Vitaly Kuznetsov, took a different turn. After serving his sentence, the former police officer and leader of the Shubniki was released in February 2012. It seemed that he would try to disappear into the crowd and never return to a life of crime. But 9 years passed, and in the spring of 2021, his name reappeared in the news. In April of that year, criminal investigators received information that Kuznetsov might be storing weapons and ammunition. Soon, operatives established his identity and place of residence, after which they detained him. During a search of the former wolf in uniform's car and garage, they found an entire arsenal: several items resembling pistols, a carbine with an optical sight, and ammunition of various calibers. Moreover, investigators said that explosives were also found in Kuznetsov's possession. Kuznetsov himself claimed that he had been storing the weapons since the 1990s, just in case. But when he learned that law enforcement agencies were interested in them, he decided to move them from their old hiding place to a more secure location. This version seemed dubious. It is hard to believe that a former police officer and leader of one of Samara's most violent gangs kept an arsenal for decades, just like that. As a result, a new criminal case was brought against him on 2 counts: illegal possession of weapons and illegal possession of explosives. The maximum punishment for these articles was up to 5 years in prison and a fine of up to 100,000 rubles. How this story ended and what punishment Kuznetsov ultimately received is still unknown.